Hey guys, tonight we chase a breeze no one remembers, one that might have moved faster than light. Not a gust of wind in the usual sense, no fluttering curtains or rustling leaves. This is a different kind of current, one that allegedly caught the attention of NASA for just a whisper of a moment before being scrubbed from existence. And tonight, you're not just hearing about it, you're walking right into it. But, fair warning, you might accidentally open a drawer of the universe that refuses to shut again. Or at least discover that wind isn't always what it seems, and reality may come with optional settings. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your city and current time in the comments, just so I know where in space-time we're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in an archive room that smells like baking paper and glue that has outlived its usefulness. Not digital. Not catalogued. Real paper, typed, stamped, slightly yellowed, stuffed in beige folders with titles like Ionospheric Disturbances, Secondary Protocols. It's the kind of room where secrets go not to be hidden, but to be quietly forgotten by design. And then you find it. A slim blue folder without a barcode. Just a label that reads, FTL Wind, Phase I, Internal Draft. Your brain does that double-take thing it does when it reads something that shouldn't exist. Faster than light wind? That breaks about 12 laws of physics before breakfast. You open it anyway. Inside, one briefing memo, 3 pages long, marked NASA Internal Use Only, 1973. It outlines the results of a high-altitude balloon experiment in Arizona that briefly detected anomalous momentum drift at 57 kilometers altitude. The wording is clinical, but one line is underlined in red pencil. The pressure increase was detected without mass present. No wind, no air molecules, but something had pushed the sensor, just enough to trigger the drift indicator, calibrated to pick up movement finer than a bee landing. You pause. You reread. It doesn't say what caused the push. It just says the instrument was later recalibrated to avoid future misreadings. Misreading. Right. Next to the memo is a single black and white photograph. A balloon gondola suspended under a long cable, above which is handwritten in block letters, Zephyr 1. The sky behind it is almost white, overexposed. There's no horizon. Just this, floaty stillness. You check the NASA database. No mention of Zephyr 1. You search deeper, university repositories, FOIA dumps, obscure PDF scans from aeronautics journals printed during the Nixon administration. Still nothing. But something weird does start to show up. Other files referencing unexplained vector events in upper atmosphere research. Mostly dismissed. One memo says it's probably thermal expansion anomalies. Another suggests stratospheric tension drift. No one commits to saying what it is, but they all seem oddly cautious, as if stepping too far into that question would pull them somewhere unprintable. Eventually, you find a footnote in a 1975 conference transcript. A researcher offhandedly mentions subetheric flow misattribution as a reason for abandoning a test. Subetheric flow. That's not a standard term. You grab your notebook. This is where the dots start to form, just not in a straight line. That's when it hits you. This isn't about propulsion, at least not yet. It's about detection. They weren't trying to ride the wind. They were trying to figure out if it existed. There's a half-page field note attached at the back of the folder, written in pencil by a technician named L. Kaminsky. It reads, reading spiked for 4.2 seconds. No wind. No temp change. Just pressure. No tremor. Nothing local. Felt like being pushed from inside the air itself. Crew disoriented. Dr. Rayburn said, that wasn't weather. You underline that last sentence in your mind. That wasn't weather. Outside the archive room, a vent kicks on. You hear a low hum of circulating air. It sounds ordinary, but now you start to notice how air moves without moving. How sometimes a room feels different even if nothing changes. And for the first time, you ask yourself something so simple it feels almost illegal. What if the wind isn't blowing through you? What if it's blowing around what you think is space? And what if someone noticed that and decided not to tell? You slide the folder back where you found it, though you already know you're not done. Some winds don't leave trails. They leave echoes. The next morning, you wake up thinking about that phrase, subetheric flow. It sticks to your brain like gum under a desk, something low-tech and overlooked but impossible to ignore. You try to search for it in formal physics literature, but it's a dead end. No peer-reviewed articles. No standard models. Just forum threads filled with either conspiracy theorists or people who type in all caps about zero-point energy and reptilian weather systems. You're tempted to dismiss it, until you stumble across a 1981 NASA patent application filed by someone named Dr. R.C. Hallberg. Title: Atmospheric Momentum Transfer via Quantum Lensing. You read it twice. The summary makes your brain hiccup. A method to harness directional force from the vacuum pressure differential present in Casimir cavities during stratospheric flow. Translation: they were playing with the idea that the vacuum itself might exert pressure, if squeezed just right. It's like trying to get pushback from nothing by bending space until it frowns at you. And right there, in the footnotes, you find a familiar word, Zephyr. Specifically, the footnote references field observation, Zephyr 2, see Appendix C. But Appendix C is missing. Of course it is. Now it's personal. You pivot from patents to old press releases, NASA outreach stuff, the kind of clippings archived in weird places like microfilm drawers at defunded state colleges. And boom, a single paragraph buried in a local paper from 1974. At 9:42 a.m., balloon Zephyr 2 launched from an Arizona test site experienced unanticipated directional acceleration. NASA described the event as a benign atmospheric irregularity. No injuries. No comment from project lead Dr. Hallberg. Benign atmospheric irregularity. That's a poetic way to say something pushed it sideways without explanation. You keep digging. That's when you find it. A scanned newsletter from a 1975 meeting of the Balloon Experimenters Guild of America. Yes, apparently that was a thing. One article is titled, When the Sky Slaps Back. It's written like a joke, playful, light-hearted, but mentions how the Zephyr 2 team saw compass drift without magnetic cause and lost telemetry for 11 minutes during a burst of solar quiet. You reread that phrase, solar quiet. No solar flares. No storms, just silence. And in that silence, the wind blew faster than anything was supposed to. You reach out to a retired atmospheric physicist named Dr. Susan Feldman. She's written about high-altitude strangeness and once described the upper stratosphere as a mood ring with trust issues. On a call, you ask her if she's ever heard of faster-than-light wind. She laughs softly. I don't think wind can go faster than light, she says. But I've seen sensors register something moving when nothing should be moving. And sometimes, those sensors weren't broken. You press her, like Zephyr? Her voice gets quieter. I was a postdoc on Zephyr 2. We weren't allowed to keep our notes. You let that sit for a second. What do you think you saw? She hesitates, and then says something you'll be thinking about for days. It felt like a wave passed through the air, but the air didn't move. You ask her what that means. I don't know, she says. That's the part that still bothers me. You hang up. You now have 3 breadcrumbs that shouldn't exist, a folder that was never logged, a pressure spike that came from nowhere, and a balloon that moved sideways while the sky did absolutely nothing. There's a pattern forming, but it's not linear. It curves, like a slipstream around something too smooth to touch. You sketch it out. Timeline, theories, keywords. FTL wind. Quantum lensing. Casimir cavities. Solar quiet. No air. Just pressure. It all loops back to a single premise so quietly radical it might have been dismissed just to avoid panic. What if there's a layer of physical behavior above the atmosphere? One we can't measure directly, but that sometimes taps us on the shoulder. Not gravity, not radiation, not weather, something else. And if that layer exists, even fleetingly, it means the laws we lean on have exceptions they politely forgot to mention. Your notes now fill 5 pages. You circle one phrase: it wasn't weather. You remember the technician's words, the pressure that pushed without air, and the way everyone seemed so eager to forget. And that's when the idea takes hold. Maybe NASA didn't stop researching FTL wind because it failed. Maybe they stopped because it worked just long enough to scare them. You spend the next few days drifting between half-read papers and restless thoughts. The phrase, "a wave passed through the air, but the air didn't move," keeps looping in your mind like a song lyric with no chorus. You try to recreate what it would feel like, walking through stillness, yet feeling something pass through your bones. You wonder if this is what fish feel when a boat cuts the surface miles above. You end up in the archives of a lesser-known journal called Aerodynamic Anomalies Quarterly. Most of it is filled with fringe theories and half-baked speculation, things about magnetically controlled hailstorms or ball lightning that hums Beethoven. But tucked into Volume 7, Issue 3, there's an article by a Dr. Lenora Vicks titled Microbursts in the Vacuum Layer, Notes from an Abandoned Balloon Program. That's when your heartbeat changes tempo. Vicks had access to the Zephyr archives, briefly, before funding was pulled. She describes an experiment that involved a tethered balloon with layered foil sensors designed to measure vacuum fluctuation, not wind, not pressure, but something she called density drift. She theorized that this drift wasn't atmospheric, nor gravitational. Instead, it was a temporary change in the way space itself behaved around the sensor. It wasn't a breeze. It was like the space around the balloon got slick, and then frictionless, and then gone. She includes a table of anomalies. Row 9 jumps out. Zephyr, 3 test, 1978. Telemetry loss for 17 seconds. Balloon rises 12 meters vertically while still tethered. Atmospheric readings, 0. Barometric anomaly, negative spike of 0.7 psi. Gravity, unchanged. Weather, clear skies. Conclusion, phantom lift. Phantom lift. You repeat the term aloud. It sounds like a magician's final trick. According to her, this effect happened 3 times, always during solar minimum, always between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., and always over desert. Why desert? She didn't know. Maybe stillness matters, she wrote. Maybe emptiness is required. You lean back and wonder, what if wind isn't the only thing that moves? What if space occasionally twitches, like a shrug? And what if NASA noticed it and tried to ride it? You dig back into Hallberg's early experiments. Before NASA, he had been a researcher at Stanford, dabbling in what he called null field dynamics, a euphemism, apparently, for poking the Casimir effect with a very expensive stick. He proposed the idea that if you could stack vacuum layers, multiple Casimir cavities in precise configurations, you could get movement from nothing. Like sailing through a sea where the wind is made of differences in nothingness. A colleague of his, a junior lab assistant named Keith Moyers, had left a single blog post in 2003, the kind of thing buried on a free hosting site with blinking GIFs and Comic Sans font. But one paragraph punches you in the gut. We thought we were creating pressure gradients. But looking back, I think we were making pockets of wrong. Places where reality hiccuped and said, okay, but just this once. You don't know what's scarier, that they might have actually made these pockets, or that they didn't understand what they were making. So you follow the breadcrumb trail to one of the last confirmed Zephyr launches, in 1984. This time, the documentation includes something odd, a classified memo regarding directional resonance artifacts. It was meant for internal review only, but someone leaked a partial scan in the early days of the internet. It's blurry, redacted, but a single line is clear. Confirmed vector anomaly mimicking inertial force at FTL approximation. Do not publish. Risk misclassification as propulsion. FTL approximation. Not actual faster than light travel, but something that mimicked its effect. Like getting shoved forward just fast enough to make the rest of you question your place in the universe. You sit back, stunned. If they found a way to create directional force without mass acceleration, that's not just propulsion. That's rewriting how force works. You draw a simple diagram, a balloon, a pocket of slick space, a pulse, and you suddenly see what they might have seen: movement without push, change without friction, and maybe, just maybe, wind. That isn't air. The question isn't whether NASA studied it. The question is, how close did they get? You return to the idea of phantom lift, like it's a riddle you half-solved in a dream. There's something mesmerizing about the notion, a balloon rising without wind, without buoyancy, as if space itself gave it a gentle nudge. You imagine yourself tethered to the Earth, then suddenly lifted, not by force, but by a shift in the rules. It's not propulsion. It's permission. You start sketching, badly, on a napkin. A vacuum chamber. An array of nanofoils. A microwave pulse. You don't really know what you're doing, but you feel like a kid trying to copy ancient runes just to see if something magical happens. You add a note, not a fan, not a jet, a permission engine. You laugh at yourself, then stop laughing, because the phrase hits a little too hard. You track down more of Hallberg's fringe work, white papers that never got published, but were passed around like secrets at conferences. One of them is titled Synthetic Drift, Field Modulation as a Proxy for Spatial Momentum. It's full of technical jargon and broken math, but one line near the end stands out. If wind can exist in a vacuum, then what we call vacuum isn't truly empty. It's a medium, just one we haven't defined yet. It reminds you of how old maps once labeled uncharted oceans with "Here be dragons." Maybe Hallberg was just scribbling in the void, but maybe he saw the outlines of something swimming just beneath zero. You stumble upon a tiny, weird footnote in a 1991 NASA symposium transcript. It's about remote sensing during high-altitude tests. The speaker, unidentified, mentions thermoelastic wake deformation. That sounds normal until you read the context. There was no heat source, no mechanical vibration, yet we observed expansion wake in test foils. Almost like the material was reacting to being moved through. Not moved by something. Moved through something. You blink and reread. You think of those strange desert flights, the balloons that drifted in stillness. Maybe they weren't being lifted. Maybe they were slipping. But slipping through what? You remember something from undergrad, gravitational lensing. The way space bends near massive objects, like stars or black holes, causing light to shift and warp. What if the same could happen locally, on a much smaller scale, if space warped just enough to move something sitting inside it? You Google localized vacuum curvature. You get crackpot forums, sci-fi blogs, and a single unreadable thesis from a kid at MIT in 1997 who dropped out 2 months later. But tucked deep inside is a diagram of a circular chamber with what looks like radar dishes pointing at a graphite sphere suspended in air. The caption reads, "Attempt to simulate inertial asymmetry through zero-point manipulation. No observed drift, but weird buzzing." You start to see a pattern. They didn't get propulsion, but they kept getting artifacts. Buzzing, slippage, anomalies. Not enough to publish, just enough to make them keep coming back. You find an old patent filed by a contractor who worked on Zephyr. It's for a non-reactive oscillation chamber. The drawings look more like an art installation than a science device, coils nested inside lattices inside a vacuum. But the description includes a chilling line. Initial tests yielded asymmetrical inertial response in otherwise balanced masses. Duration, 0.6 seconds. Replication failed. You think, Maybe that's the key. It's not stable. It's not controllable. But it's real. A breeze, felt for only a moment, in a place where there should be none. Maybe that's why NASA shelved it. Not because it didn't work, but because it worked too unpredictably. Because no one could explain why it worked. And in aerospace, guessing can kill. You go outside. It's a still night. No wind. The trees barely rustle. But for a moment, you imagine it, an invisible current brushing past your skin. Not from the atmosphere. From reality itself shifting a little to the left. And the wildest thing? You wouldn't even feel it. Not directly. Just in the way your thoughts suddenly feel slightly out of phase. In how your phone's signal glitches. In how a cloud disappears and you can't remember if it was ever there. It wouldn't be a gust. It would be a whisper. And science doesn't know how to listen to whispers yet. You find yourself digging deeper into the desert. Figuratively at first, then literally. The Zephyr site, as it's casually referred to in the few declassified snippets, is somewhere in the Mojave, tucked between forgotten airfields and long-closed missile silos. You imagine driving there in an old pickup, windshield streaked with dust, a cheap gas station map marked with circles and question marks. You don't tell anyone where you're going. Not because it's illegal, just because no one would believe you. There's nothing much when you arrive. No fences, no guards. Just cracked concrete foundations, rusted bolts sticking up like fossilized teeth. But the air here feels strange. Still, yes. But heavy, like it's remembering something. You step over a broken pipe and crouch next to what might have been a grounding rod. The metal is scorched in a very specific way, just around the base. You take out your phone to photograph it, but the screen glitches, then goes black. You laugh nervously. Maybe it's just the heat, or maybe the wind is watching. You find a half-buried crate, military issue. Inside, faded blueprints, mold-eaten notebooks, and one laminated tag that reads, "Do not adjust phase during lift calibration." You say it aloud and immediately regret it. Because phase of what? Calibration of where? Back at the motel, the kind where the curtains don't quite close and the AC hums like it's dying, you go through the papers. The notes aren't all in English. Some pages are in German, others in Russian, one in a neat spiral script you assume is math. There's a sketch that looks suspiciously like a balloon, but not one that floats. This one dangles, suspended from a ring of what the diagram calls torsion plates. There's a phrase underlined 3 times. The wind must become the machine. You write it down, then stare at it for 20 minutes. When you wake up the next morning, yes, when, not if, your notes are disorganized. Someone's been through them. But there's no sign of forced entry. Only a smell in the air like burnt ozone and an odd residue on your laptop trackpad, like dried graphite. You try to tell yourself it's all normal. But you know what normal feels like. This isn't it. You call a physicist friend you haven't spoken to in 5 years. She listens quietly, then says, "Wind can't exist in a vacuum, unless the vacuum is moving around something stationary." You pause. That doesn't make sense. She replies, "Exactly." She tells you about an old theoretical concept that never made it into mainstream physics, wind frame inertia. The idea that movement isn't always linear through time and space, but can happen through reference fluid. Basically, space itself flowing like a river, and you being carried along whether you want to or not. But, she adds, if you could tack against that current, like a sailboat on water, you could move without thrust. No fuel, just angle. You hear yourself whisper, "An inertial sail." There's silence on the other end. Then she says, "That's what they were trying to build. Not an engine, a rudder." Back at the site later that day, you realize something that makes you sit down hard on the cracked foundation slab. The structures weren't built for launch. They were built for orientation. You dig with your hands. The sand is loose and dry, and after 30 minutes, your fingers hit metal. A hatch. Bolted shut. No label. Just a faint, circular imprint, like something once spun here, very slowly, until it wore down the paint. You don't try to open it. You know better. Some doors are meant to stay closed until the right breeze comes. Later, as you're driving away, you look in the rearview mirror. The wind kicks up just once. But not around you, around the air itself. Like something behind the curtain just breathed out. And no one can explain it. Not even NASA. You're not exactly sure when the word plasma starts showing up in the notes, but once it does, it's everywhere. At first, it feels out of place, like a sci-fi buzzword sneaking into an otherwise grounded research log. But soon you realize that to the engineers behind the faster-than-light wind project, plasma wasn't just relevant, it was central. You're sitting at your desk now, lights dimmed, sipping lukewarm tea while the stack of photocopied diagrams looms beside you. One is labeled Dynamic Ion Lattice under directional stress. There's a hand-drawn arc, an atmospheric cross-section, that looks suspiciously like the upper ionosphere. But here's the thing, they've annotated wind patterns that don't exist. Jet streams that loop vertically. It's as if someone mapped turbulence on the edge of space, and instead of predicting weather, they were predicting propulsion. You rub your temples. A small sticky note at the bottom of the page catches your eye. Faded pink ink, blocky handwriting. Like riding thunder. If we can fold it, we can glide. You take a breath. Read it again. Fold what? Turns out, a small subgroup within the research team, never formally named, but frequently referred to in internal memos as the blue cell, believed that plasma could be shaped into aerodynamic structures. Not just as energy, but as material. In other words, invisible wings made of charged particles. You're talking about plasma sails. The idea wasn't to push against air or even gravity, but against variations in electromagnetic density, literally surfing on space itself. Sounds nuts, right? Except in 2010, a researcher at the University of Tokyo accidentally triggered a sustained plasma curtain in a vacuum chamber that bent incoming radiation by 11%. The data was inconclusive. The experiment wasn't repeated. The notes vanished. But here, in your lap, is a drawing from the 1970s that matches that exact setup, down to the angle of the copper rods. And here's the kicker. Their model predicted a localized warp effect. No, not Star Trek warp. Not folding spacetime into tacos. But a tiny, directional ripple in massless flow. Like a sailboat catching a breeze that isn't technically there. It gets weirder. In one of the Blue Cell's last test logs, they describe an outdoor trial at an undisclosed site, very likely Nevada, using a high-altitude balloon with an attached plasma sail emitter. They launched it during a quiet solar cycle to minimize magnetic noise. The balloon never came back. But the radar trace did something odd. For 0.6 seconds, it disappeared from all radar, then reappeared 30 kilometers east. No debris. No malfunction report. Just a scribbled comment on the margin. We didn't account for directional phase collapse. The sail didn't catch wind. It caught time. You sit back, stunned. If true, that would mean they weren't just experimenting with wind as force. They were redefining motion entirely. Plasma sails catching temporal differentials instead of momentum. It's the physics equivalent of holding up a kite and having yesterday pull it forward. Naturally, the official review shut it down. Unreliable data. Environmental interference. No repeatable results. But the language changes after that. Suddenly, the memos don't say wind. They say tunnel. Suddenly, they're not trying to fly anymore. They're trying to drift. You get chills, not because of what you're reading, but because it feels like you've just touched something alive. Something still moving, deep under the surface of this abandoned research. You close the notebook and stare out the window. It's a still night. Not even a breeze. But you feel it. Something brushing past. Like wind in a vacuum. like plasma remembering it used to be fire. And somewhere, deep in a forgotten lab or classified folder, a scientist once whispered to themselves, "If we can't go faster than light, what if we just ask it to carry us?" No one has ever explained what happened to that balloon. Not convincingly. You dreamt of a desert last night. Not the kind with rolling sand dunes and camels, but something more clinical, sterile. A blank concrete slab in the middle of nowhere, buzzing faintly with equipment that shouldn't exist yet. And in that dream, you watched something rise, a small device, silent, surrounded by men who didn't speak, only observed. And then it was gone, upward, or inward, or elsewhere. You're not sure. When you wake, there's still that hum in your ears. You decide it's time to trace the funding trail. Not because you expect a neat explanation, but because when projects vanish, the money always leaves a footprint. And footprints, as you now know, are the closest thing to ghost science believes in. You start with a tiny grant proposal from 1981. It's for something called harmonic flow optimization in semi-vacuum conditions. Harmless enough. It's tucked into a Department of Energy archive, probably misfiled. But the team requesting the money? Two familiar names from the plasma sale notes. You feel the first spark of connection. The project was officially budgeted at $32,000. The ledger shows a disbursement of $4.7 million. That's not a typo. And it's not the last. Over the next 4 years, the same team received a total of $46 million through 6 separate shell organizations, each with names like Ether Dynamics Research Group and Subatmospheric Flow Studies Initiative. They all share the same P.O. Box address in Maryland, an address that, as of 2006, belongs to a laundromat. You Google it. The laundromat's Google reviews are oddly poetic. One says, "Time moves differently here." Another just reads, "Ask about the elevator." You don't know whether to laugh or be nervous. Probably both. But it's not just the money. It's what the receipts say. One entry is for custom vacuum glass sphere, 6 meters diameter. Another, variable frequency radiation gate array, experimental, non-harmonic. And then the weirdest of them all, ion mass tether with quantum drift feedback loop, non-commercial. That last one doesn't even sound like something a human being should be allowed to own. You dig deeper. An FOIA request filed in 1992 attempted to access the project's final report. It was denied. Reason: data no longer exists in terrestrial archive. That's the exact wording. Not classified. Not missing. Just no longer here. Someone wrote that with a straight face. You check the author of the funding proposal, Dr. Lena Kurzweil, unlisted in most databases. But one academic paper from 1974 lists her as a co-author on a study titled Gravitic Refractive Potentials and Temporal Slipstream Phenomena. The lead author, a physicist named Emilio Drazik, who disappeared in 1983 during a trip to Arizona. And now your browser tabs are a graveyard of abandoned ideas. Everything points to one test, one that happened in secret, unrecorded except in the quiet hush of financial anomalies and whispered footnotes. They didn't publish. They didn't patent. But they built it. You're sure of it now. A device that caught wind, not the kind that brushes your face, but the kind that lives in the gaps between time and mass. NASA never officially acknowledged the project. But 2 years after its funding ceased, a white paper appeared in an unrelated Department of Defense journal. One paragraph stood out. In the event of a successful harmonic divergence cascade, directional flow might exceed c without violating local causality, provided containment symmetry is upheld for less than Planck time per cycle. You reread that 3 times. They're saying it's possible to cheat light. Just long enough to slip. No one has ever cited the paper. It's as if it doesn't want to be remembered. You close your laptop. Outside, the sky is cloudless. Stars blink like soft Morse code. And as you stare upward, a ridiculous question floats into your mind, uninvited and unreasonable. What if the stars are just pinholes left by something that already passed through? You don't laugh. You just breathe. Softly. Because for a brief moment, the air feels like it's carrying more than just weather. You've seen blueprints before. You've sifted through dusty engineering plans for bridges, satellites, even conceptual Mars habitats that never made it past PowerPoint. But nothing prepares you for the document you find next. It's titled simply, Windbox. Printed in Courier font. Page 1 of 47. The file was buried in the NASA Ames Research Center's deprecated archives. Not password protected, but not searchable either. It was only there because someone had misspelled window in the document metadata. You open it. Page 1 greets you with a schematic, not of a craft, but of a cube, roughly 3 meters by 3 meters, suspended in a vacuum chamber. Every face of the cube is covered in something called Chernix plating. That's not a material you recognize, and Google isn't helpful either. One forum suggests it was a prototype coating meant to dampen narrative coherence. You make a mental note to revisit that later, maybe when your grip on reality feels stronger. The document outlines the theory behind directed temporal flow induction. In plain English, they were trying to build a box that traps time, then lets it leak. The mechanism is deeply weird. Inside the cube, layered fans, yes, literal fans, are arranged in Fibonacci spirals. Each fan blade is constructed of alternating superconductive and dielectric materials. They don't spin. Instead, they're pulsed, timed to shift magnetic fields in synchronized asymmetry, something called non-holonomic cascade timing. According to the notes, this arrangement creates internal inertial cancellation, resulting in a localized vacuum state with pressure lower than standard quantum noise. The engineers called it the zero hiss point. Past that, wind, real, touchable wind, begins to move inside the box, even in total vacuum. That wind, they wrote, could not be measured by normal instruments. It existed in readings taken only once, by one device, which burned out instantly after recording a velocity of 1.02 c, unbounded. You pause. They're saying the wind exceeded the speed of light. You scroll further, your heart oddly steady, like it's reserving panic for later. The team's lead mechanical engineer described hearing the wind during the test, a high harmonic moan, like metal remembering a song. The sound allegedly continued for 7 hours after the experiment concluded, despite all power being shut off. The cube itself was found slightly rotated on its mount, even though it was bolted down. But what unsettles you more than the data is the tone of the final page. There are no conclusions, no charts, just a note, handwritten and scanned. This is not propulsion. It is permission. You sit with that sentence. You read it again. Then again. It echoes. This wasn't about building something that moves. It was about convincing space-time to let them go. You close the document and lean back. The room feels suddenly heavier. Not ominous, just present. Like someone is watching politely from across a dinner table, waiting for you to finish dessert before they say something important. And still, the word windbox hangs in your thoughts like a paper lantern in the dark. A few clicks later, you find the author of the schematic, Dr. Anika Vesna, who published a handful of papers in the late 1980s on acoustic field mechanics. She disappeared in 1991 while hiking near Mount Shasta. Her last published statement was in an obscure engineering journal. There is more gravity in music than in mass. The wind listens. You'd scoff, but at this point, you believe her. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you start to wonder, not whether the windbox worked, but whether right now it's still working. Maybe that wind never stopped. Maybe it's just very good at hiding. You spend the next few days in quiet obsession. Not the dramatic, pacing back and forth kind, but the subtle, background humming kind. The windbox refuses to leave you alone. It's like a melody you can't place but keep whistling anyway. Eventually, your search leads you to something stranger than documents, and more persistent than math. A tape. Real magnetic tape. Labeled in neat handwriting, FTLW, AV, test 03.wave, Anika. No one has digitized it. It's not in NASA's main audio archives. You only find it because a retired Ames technician runs a niche blog where he catalogs recordings that were never meant to be heard twice. His site is mostly space shuttle comms and antenna tuning noises, but buried on page 39 is your prize. You play the file. At first, it's silence. Then, faintly, the sound of wind, but not natural wind. It has rhythm. Not music exactly, but pattern. Like it's trying to remember how to become music. It surges, then pulls back. Surges again. Every few seconds, there's a whisper beneath it. It's hard to catch, like it's just outside the range of language. But you hear a name. Whispered once, clearly, at the 3-minute mark. Your name. You freeze. The file is dated 1990. You were born years after that. No one could have known. And yet, there it is. Spoken like someone breathing it into your ear from across a great, soft distance. You shut your laptop and stare at the wall for a full 10 minutes. You've crossed some kind of threshold. The rest of the evening is a blur, but eventually you find a forum thread discussing the Windbox's internal harmonics. One user, known only as reverse entropy, mentions something called causal drift cones. According to them, when a localized environment experiences asymmetric time pressure, like the Windbox allegedly created, sound can leak backward through the drift cone and imprint on materials, sometimes before the event even happens. Which means, the whisper on the tape didn't come from the past. It came from your future. You try to rationalize. Maybe it's a glitch. Maybe it's a trick of audio resolution. Maybe someone somewhere is just very good at messing with people who dig too deep into forgotten NASA archives. But then comes the real kicker. You trace the blog's hosting info. Just curiosity, nothing serious. Except, the domain registry shows something impossible. The site was created 3 days before your search began. Backdated to look old, yes, but the actual server went live less than a week ago. You refresh the page. It's gone. The entire site. Error 404. You sit very still. For the first time, you notice the air in your room isn't still. There's a draft, not from any open window or fan, but from the center of the room itself. Just the faintest whisper of movement, brushing against your skin in a way that doesn't align with any normal airflow. You place your hand in the center of the space. It's cold. Not freezing, just precise, like the air is doing math around your fingers. You don't move. You don't speak. But you start to wonder, maybe the Windbox wasn't just a physics experiment. Maybe it was a question sent into the void. And maybe, just maybe, something has started to answer. The air settles by morning, almost like it was never disturbed. No cold draft. No whisper of wind that wasn't really wind. Just you, your laptop, and the lingering pressure of being watched by something that doesn't need eyes. You decide to shift focus. The blog is gone, but that tape, FTLW, AV, test 03, still haunts you. You try to verify its origin. Tracing archived satellite networks and comms logs from the 1990s isn't exactly easy, but then you remember something. Every NASA recording session, even test ones, had to be assigned a building code. And AV, test 03.wave. That points you to a place. A facility known only as Building 943. The name alone sounds like an urban legend. You don't find it on any maps, not even historical ones. It's not listed in any facility index. And even the Freedom of Information Act requests return redacted blocks with vague language like, no records available, or refer to internal handler. But you find a photo. It's blurry, probably scanned from a printed document. But there it is, a low, concrete structure surrounded by wild grass, with faded lettering above the entrance. 943, silence calibration. You pause at that. What does that even mean, calibrating silence? You drive. It takes 5 hours and a tank and a half of gas to reach the edges of the Mojave Desert, where GPS turns into guesswork and dirt roads decide whether they're real based on mood. But eventually, the terrain looks familiar. Scrubland, low hills, and then the unmistakable silhouette of that building from the photo. It's real. More intact than you expected, but clearly long abandoned. The door creaks. You enter. Inside, utter silence. Not the usual kind. No echoes, no ambient hum, not even the faint ringing your ears make when there's nothing else to hear. Just flat, oppressive stillness. It presses against your skin like static you can't hear but can feel. You find a control room. The consoles are dusty but surprisingly untouched. As if everyone just left. Not in a hurry. Just done. One machine still has power. A glowing green screen asks for a command. Load wind sample? You stare. Type. Yes. The room dims. A speaker embedded in the wall emits a soft hum, then, the same wind you heard on the tape. Identical. The same pulse. Same pattern. And then it stops. The screen now says, calibration failed. Source moved. You don't know what that means, but then a drawer clicks open. Inside, a folder marked Zephyr 6, non-echo events. The file includes hand-drawn diagrams of what look like atmospheric structures, concentric waves orbiting something labeled null anchor. Another page lists timestamps with notes like failed TO record event, received negative time signature, and vented data into conceptual space. You blink at that one. Conceptual space? That's not a real term. Except it is. One of the diagrams matches something you saw in an obscure theoretical paper from the late 1980s, written by a scientist named Dr. Marla Virek. The paper argued that if the fabric of spacetime were to oscillate fast enough, like in high-frequency gravitational waves, it might become briefly permeable to information from future conceptual states. In other words, you could feel data before it arrived. Even stranger, Dr. Virek disappeared in 1993. Not died, just disappeared. No record of resignation, no obituary, no further publications. Just gone. And in the folder you're holding now, her signature appears on every page. You sit on the concrete floor, folder in your lap, speaker still humming faintly behind you. For a moment, you imagine the silence pressing into your bones isn't empty at all. It's full, overflowing. With every signal never heard, every wind never mapped, every answer whispered too early or too late to make sense. And for the first time, you understand something. Maybe NASA didn't cancel the project because it failed. Maybe they canceled it because it worked. You don't leave building 943 immediately. You just sit there for a while, cross-legged on the floor like a student waiting for a lecture from an invisible professor. The silence isn't oppressive anymore. It's conversational. Like the room is waiting for you to ask a better question. You take the folder. Back at the motel, you spread the pages out like a tarot reading gone rogue. There are 15 distinct, non-echo events, all labeled Zephyr 1 through Zephyr 15. Each entry includes wind velocity readings, some of which exceed the speed of light, at least on paper, and a field labeled Echo Return. Most say none. 1. Zephyr 6 says unknown. Negative return pattern. You remember that phrase from the tape's transcript. Whatever happened during that test, it didn't bounce back. You try to piece together a timeline. Zephyr 1 occurred in 1991. By Zephyr 7, the data stops being collected altogether. The folder jumps forward into what looks like handwritten memos and, oddly, shipping logs. One name pops up repeatedly, M. Virek. Apparently, in the weeks after Zephyr 6, Dr. Virek requested something called a conceptual compression chamber be built at another location. Coordinates that point to an unlisted research facility near Lake Vostok. Yes, the buried Antarctic lake. That's when your eyebrows hit the ceiling. You look deeper. You find a note tucked inside the folder, written in hasty, tilted script. It reads, "We've only ever thought of wind as a force moving through space. But what if it can move space itself? Not bend it like gravity, but slide it along a pressure front. A silent one." The handwriting matches an old lecture slide of Dr. Virex you found earlier. You double-check. Same flourishes on the lowercase g. Same obsessive habit of underlining her own thoughts. Okay. So now you're following a woman who may or may not have used invisible wind to slide pieces of spacetime across itself like Jenga blocks. Sure. Why not? You call a friend from undergrad, Max. He works in atmospheric modeling now, probably because he liked clouds more than people. You ask him a vague question about wind and nonlinear propagation. He pauses. You mean like soliton behavior in pressure gradients? Kind of. But what if the pressure moves before it's generated? Max goes quiet. Then, that's a closed-loop causality problem. You can't have an effect arrive before the cause, unless you're talking about information running backward. Are you into tachyon theories now? You hesitate. Maybe. Max groans, then says, "You know someone proposed that in the 90s? A NASA intern, I think. They got blacklisted after submitting a paper that suggested Earth's atmosphere could briefly generate a localized FTL signal during upper tropospheric collapses." You almost drop the phone. That matches something in Zephyr 3. Localized dissipation, compression rebound exceeding predictive velocity. Nonlinear acceleration curve initiated by tropospheric collapse at Site B. Max keeps talking. Anyway, the weirdest part. That intern claimed they felt the event. Like a physical sensation. Not wind. More like a push from inside their own ribs. You hang up shortly after. Not because the conversation's over, but because your ears are ringing. The same way they did back in Building 943. You pull out the tape one more time. Play it. But this time, instead of just listening to the wind, you watch the waveform. And there it is. At timestamp 32 minutes and 5 seconds, a spike. Not in sound, but in the tape's metadata. An embedded message, hidden in the data channel. It reads, "IT arrived." And suddenly, you realize you're not chasing a failed experiment. You're chasing something that's already here. You don't sleep. You try. But the words keep circling your head like orbiting debris. It arrived. What arrived? When? How? You sit on the floor, laptop open, the motel's humming air conditioning acting as your only grounding reality. You scroll through old NOAA data from 1991. There was a sudden pressure drop over the Central Pacific that year. One no one explained. Not storm-related. No cyclone, no front. Just a massive sharp plunge that lasted exactly 23 seconds. Scientists chalked it up to sensor error. But it happened on the same date as Zephyr 6. You flip back to the file from Building 943. A note you missed. Scrawled at the bottom of a page, JPL advised atmospheric glitches could be early indicators. Tell Owen. You don't know who Owen is. Not yet. But you find another clue in the shipping logs. A crate marked Zephyr 13 materials, fragile, non-magnetic, conceptual payload only, was shipped to a location with no name, just grid coordinates. You look them up. It's in Nevada, just outside Tonopah Test Range, where, conveniently, a dry lakebed the size of Manhattan sits undisturbed. And then it hits you. They didn't abandon the project. They moved it. You're on a road again before the sun's up. Nevada is quieter than it should be. The highway curves endlessly through pale, sleeping terrain. You don't see another car for hours. The coordinates lead you to a fence. No signage, no guards. Just a padlocked gate and a tiny, leaning signpost where the metal has rusted into illegibility. But inside the fence, a hangar. Not a big one. Not Area 51 big, but big enough to store a jet. Or maybe something that looks like a jet, but doesn't fly. Something that rides invisible currents. You jump the fence. You're not proud of it. The hangar is unlocked. Inside is a strange, circular rail system embedded in the floor. No moving parts now, just dust and grease stains shaped like wheels. You notice a hatch in the far corner, leading downward. Of course there's a basement. There are stairs, and then there's a corridor lined with old equipment, oscilloscopes, signal amplifiers, a filing cabinet stuffed with water-damaged printouts. You rifle through them. One report catches your eye. Zephyr 13. Test protocol acknowledged. Phase reversal successful. Subjective field distortion noted by observer personnel. Compression wave experienced as inward pull. Sensor array failure at T plus 2.4 seconds. No return signal received. Project suspended. You pause. Suspended, not cancelled. You realize the Zephyr experiments weren't just about wind. They were about the feeling of wind. About replicating the perception of motion using ambient atmospheric pressure, and somehow folding spacetime around it. As if the wind was only ever a metaphor for something deeper, a kind of spatial tug. And then you find it. An unmarked VHS tape labeled 13.B. There's a dusty player under the desk. Against your better judgment, you plug it into a portable monitor. You hit play. It's grainy, black and white. A single test chamber, no bigger than a two-car garage. A machine rests in the middle, part satellite dish, part gyroscope, part weather balloon. One person stands beside it. Dr. Virek. She's saying something, but there's no audio. She adjusts a dial. The machine pulses. And then, nothing. Except the feed jitters. Not like a normal video glitch. More like the room jitters. You feel nauseous. As if your equilibrium is being subtly mocked by a recording that doesn't obey physics. At T plus 2.4 seconds, the image flattens, literally. The vertical resolution compresses. Dr. Virek seems to fold. Her silhouette becomes thinner and thinner until she disappears. The tape ends. You rewind. Same thing. You check the metadata burned into the analog frame. March 3, 1996. That's the last Zephyr entry date in the folder. The question isn't whether they achieved faster than light wind. The question is whether anyone ever came back from it. You sit alone in the dark, the monitor screen still glowing faintly. A new kind of chill settles in. You're no longer sure what you're chasing. The science, the people, the machine. Or maybe you're just chasing the wind, the one that bends light and folds rooms and erases people from videotapes like the world simply forgets they ever breathed. The sun's setting behind you as you drive east, out of Nevada. The tape sits on the passenger seat, coiled and silent like a sleeping snake. You've watched it 5 times now. No sound, no changes, but every time, something feels different. As if it's not showing you what happened, but what it's about to do. You pull into a diner somewhere in Utah. It's the kind of place where the waitresses call you Han, and the pie tastes like someone's grandmother still runs the back kitchen. You sit by the window and flip open your notebook. Inside, between the sketches and Zephyr timelines, you write a single sentence. What if they were trying to listen to the wind? A voice interrupts you. That's a lot of paper for someone trying to understand the weather. You look up. A man stands beside your booth. Mid-60s, desert tan skin, wearing a buttoned flannel and the kind of hat only retired scientists or cowboys wear unironically. He introduces himself as Owen. Yes, that Owen. Your breath catches. You worked on Zephyr. He nods once, carefully. A long time ago, before it got sideways. You gesture at the seat. He sits. Owen's voice is quiet, like he's still afraid someone's listening. Maybe he is. He tells you that Zephyr was never about propulsion. Not really. That was just the sales pitch. Something DARPA could justify. He leans forward. The wind we were chasing wasn't moving through space. It was space. Pockets of compressed spacetime, like wrinkles in a blanket. We thought if we could find where they formed, maybe we could ride one. You ask about the machine in the tape. That was Virec's final design, he says. We called it the Whistler. You blink. Like the wind. No, he says. Like the sound. It made a noise. A kind of hum that dropped off into silence right before the shift. That's how we knew it was working. The wind didn't blow, it paused. Like the world was holding its breath. You ask what happened after the shift. We don't know, Owen says. She never came back. And the footage didn't tell us enough. You pull out the VHS. He shakes his head. Don't play it again. That thing's not just video. It's feedback. You blink. Feedback. He leans in. You don't watch it. It watches you back. Every time you play it, you sync with it more. That nausea. That compression. It's pulling you in. A chill travels down your spine. You feel suddenly watched. Like the tape has already burrowed into your memory. Owen sighs and pushes an envelope across the table. Inside is a single photograph, a diagram drawn in red ink, half machine, half waveform. It's labeled Zephyr 14 Prototype, Virec's final draft. You need to go to VLA, he says. New Mexico. She left something there. You ask what? He smirks. A mirror. Big enough to reflect space back at itself. You leave the diner before midnight, wind in your hair, the notebook on the dashboard, and Owen's final warning echoing in your ears. If you hear the silence again, don't breathe in. Hold your breath. The wind isn't blowing. It's watching. You're not sure how you got past security. Maybe it was the badge Owen gave you, some old laminated NASA access card from the 90s, or maybe it's the way you walked in like you belonged there. Either way, the gate at the very large array opens with a reluctant creak, and the desert swallows you whole. The VLA is a cathedral of dish antennas. 27 of them. Each one a silent sentinel pointed skyward, trying to hear the universe whisper back. They rotate slowly, tracking something you can't see, as if guided by instinct rather than programming. You step out of your car and feel the air change. Not colder, not windier, just different. The sky above is too still. The clouds too frozen. You've entered the place where stories wait their turn to be remembered. Owen told you to look for Building 42. There is no Building 42 on the map. You wander between trailers and locked doors, the notebook clutched under your arm like a talisman. Eventually, you find a shed hidden behind the northernmost antenna. The number 42 is spray painted on the back in red, almost as an afterthought. You open the door. The smell of dust and copper hits first. Then the silence. Not the absence of sound. No, this silence presses. It's the kind that makes your ears ring with your own heartbeat. Inside is a single console. A dusty keyboard. A CRT monitor with a post-it that reads, "Do not boot unless coordinates stable." You boot it anyway. The screen flickers. A grid appears. Columns labeled with names that look half astrophysical, half poetic: drift phase, echo pulse, spaceline fold 3C, local time deviation. Then a familiar name, Virec. Underneath, a blinking command prompt, load Z, 14.mir. You hesitate, then type. The screen loads what looks like a waveform, but it's moving backward. Each pulse retracts instead of growing. The peaks folding into the troughs like time is recoiling. You remember Owen's words. She left a mirror here. This is it. You don't know how to activate it. But as your hand grazes the console, the room darkens. The walls blur. The silence deepens into something else. You can hear it now, the wind. But it's not outside. It's behind the walls, inside the metal. It's blowing inward, The CRT begins to hum. A low vibration. You see your reflection in the screen, but it's delayed, slightly off sync. You wave, and the reflection waves after. Then it doesn't wave at all. You freeze. The reflection watches you, blinks, smiles faintly. That's not you. You stumble back. On the screen, the reflection mouths something. One word, over and over, stop. But it's too late. A blue flash arcs across the room, like heat lightning born from inside the machine. The screen cuts to static. Then nothing. You wake up on the floor, no idea how long it's been. The sun is still up, or up again. Your watch has stopped. Your phone shows no signal, no time, no date. You stagger outside. The dishes haven't moved. But they're all pointed at you now. And above, the sky is wrong. You can't say how. The colors, the stars, the weight of it. You just know. Something answered. And it used the mirror to look back. You don't drive back. Not at first. You sit in your car with the engine off, hands on the wheel, letting your breath come back in slow, uneven waves. You stare at the VLA dish antennas, still turned toward you like curious animals, and you wait for them to blink. They don't. Your fingers tremble as you open the notebook. The same old pages. The same sketches. But now, on the margin of page 13, where there used to be only coffee stains and a doodle of a moth, there's something else. Coordinates. Written in your own handwriting. Except you've never written these numbers before. You type them into your phone. The location's real, but wrong. In the sense that it's not where anything should be. A patch of international waters off the coast of Namibia. No land, no island, no structures. Just ocean. You close the notebook and start driving. Not to the ocean. Not yet. Back to the motel. You need rest. You need a shower. You need someone else to tell you you're imagining things, that this is all just stress and caffeine and the world's weirdest shared hallucination. You get none of that. Instead, when you check your messages, you see a voice memo from Owen. It's only 3 seconds long. Static. Then a whisper, almost lost in the crackle. The wind's changing direction. You stare at the screen for a long time. Then you play it again. The wind's changing direction. You open the window. Outside, the trees are still. The world is quiet. But you know, deep in your bones, you know, there's something moving where it shouldn't. Something pushing through a place it was never meant to go. You remember what Owen once said over ramen and half a bottle of sake. There's a point where science becomes poetry. And when that happens, either you understand the metaphor, or it eats you. You didn't understand then. You're starting to now. You sit on the edge of the motel bed, listening to the silence. It's no longer comforting. It's too intentional. Like something is listening, waiting for the next sound to respond to. You speak aloud to the empty room. What do you want? The light bulb flickers. You laugh, because of course it does. The notebook is still open. The coordinates are still there. And beneath them, somehow, a new line has appeared. A sentence. Handwritten. In your handwriting. Again. But definitely not yours. It reads, "You are the wind now." Your skin tingles. There's a knock at the door. 3 taps. Then nothing. You don't move. You don't answer. But you know. The wind didn't just change direction. It came inside. So now, you lie there in the quiet, finally still. The story behind you, like a road that has slowly disappeared into fog. Your breath settles. Your thoughts stretch and dissolve like mist over warm water. Maybe it was all just theory, an idea on the edge of reason. Or maybe it really happened. Maybe the wind, the mirror, the impossible coordinates, they all belong to some forgotten page of the universe we're not supposed to read. But that's okay. You've read it now. And still, the world hasn't stopped turning. Somewhere far above your head, the dishes are still listening. Somewhere far below your dreams, the wind may still be waiting. But right now, you don't have to know what's true. You just need to rest. To let your body drift with the air, like a feather laid in stillness. The lights are low. The hum is soft. And the story has gently stepped away.